for a little bit in the book of Esther, a great story of God's faithfulness and how He cares for us. So page 354 if you're using the Bibles in your seats. If you're using your own Bible and you find Psalms, go to the left and you'll see Job, and go in front of that and you'll see Esther. We're looking at selections from this. This is our third week in Esther, and these are some things that we've read previously and some things that we haven't read previously. And this is, again, because Esther is a story that you kind of have to read chapter 10 to get chapter 1. The reading will take some time. And so I was encouraged this week in my own personal reading. I was in Nehemiah, and they read the scriptures like for a quarter of the day, and they rejoiced. And so I thought that's a good one for this week. So I'll guide us along as we look at various spots through Esther, so that we have what we need to understand what God's saying to us today in the gospel lesson. We'll begin with Esther chapter 1, verse 19. This is God's word, eternally true. Esther 1, verse 19. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. Now chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. Chapter 2, verse 8. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Now verse 12. Before a girl's turn came to go in to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. Now verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Now verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Now verse 21. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were hanged on a gallows. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. Now verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Now verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom whose customs are different from those of all the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Now verse 13. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. Now chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show it to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go into the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Now verse 6. Verse 6. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Now chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 1. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now, Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. Now chapter 7, verse 2. Chapter 7, verse 2. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king asked again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, but because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Now verse 9. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now, write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best for you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." Now verse 10. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force or any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. Now verse 15. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. Now chapter 10 and verse 3. Verse 3. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Here ends our reading. There's a response of thankfulness that's printed for us in our bulletins. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks indeed. Let's pray. We talked last week about in the midst of this world in which things happen to us, sometimes by people who just don't care or who are incompetent, like Xerxes, the king. He doesn't care. He doesn't research who are the Jews. He doesn't know his wife is a Jew. He's just kind of a foolish figure throughout the book of Esther. And he hands his signet ring over to somebody, Haman. And Haman is not incompetent. Haman is hateful to God's people. Haman is out for his own glory. And so as a result of that, he sees anyone who would steal glory from him as somebody who should be, whatever it says there, killed, destroyed, and annihilated. And so we live in such a world. Sometimes we suffer hardship because people just don't care and justice is not done. Sometimes we suffer hardship because people are against us. Our society right now is not promoting the things of the church. It's not promoting Jesus. It's not promoting the morality of Scripture. It's not promoting the order God has set into life for individuals for their own good, nor for the world for its own good. And we live in the midst of this, and we're like these Jews living in exile over in Persia, not in the promised land. And we're told that in Scripture very much, that we are exiles. Peter talks a lot about that in 1st and 2nd Peter. We're scattered throughout everywhere. And as Paul says in Philippians 3:20, but our citizenship is in heaven. The heavenly Jerusalem is where we have our citizenship. We are citizens there. We are God's people, and Jesus is our King. And so we're, expats, right? We're living outside of our homeland. In the midst of living outside of our homeland, difficult things happen to us. And so God writes this book, Esther, to people who are living outside of the promised land. They were living in Persia. These people had not returned with some of those who had returned to Jerusalem. They had stayed in their exile and later are encouraged to come back. But for now, they're still in exile. And Persia was the ruling nation. The Medes and the Persians were ruling over them. And so hard things were happening to them. And we as exiles on this earth have difficult things that happen to us. And God instructs us in how to get along and what can give us hope and what can get us through in our lives, just like he had instructed God's people when he wrote the book of Esther. And so we looked at last week, and the first points of your outline, we're just going to hit those blanks for you to remind you where we were, and we're not going to go back through these points. You can get those on YouTube if you want to. But the main point that God gives to us in Esther here is this. He says to you and to I, as believers in Jesus, rest. Rest. And that's your blank. If you like to fill out blanks in an outline, you can fill that out. If you want to just listen, that's okay too. Rest emotionally. Rest. Be at rest and continue in faith. As we live as exiles, as we live amidst hard things, difficult things happening to us, and us experiencing things not as they were intended to be when God created human beings, God says still we can be at rest and continue in faith. And this is based on some reality, but it's something that can fool us at first if we look at the world, because number one, we're to rest emotionally despite all indicators seeming to say that people are in control. People are in control. The Xerxes, the Hamans of this world are in control, not believers. So all indicators are seeming to say that people are determining things. And that's what Mordecai and Esther could see. It seemed like people were determining things. For these decrees were made, and these decrees coming out of Persia could not be revoked. And that's said a few times throughout this book. And so you see that even as that second decree is made, it's not an extracting or a canceling of the first decree. It's just creating a second decree that counterbalances the first one, because the decrees of men could not be revoked. And sometimes in our lives we see it seems like that. There's something in front of us that we can see in front of us that's going to happen to us, and we think there's no way things are going to change. I'm just going to be in this state of misery and destruction in my life. Number two, we're to rest emotionally, not only despite the fact that it seems like people are in control, but we're to rest emotionally and continue in faith despite it often appearing that God is absent. And so last week we talked about how God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. And the word God and the word Lord, they're not mentioned in the book of Esther. And that's a literary device to show that God is invisible, and we worship an invisible God. Jesus gets at this. He teaches this. The Apostle Paul says God is invisible. Jesus himself says, or John says in John 1, nobody has ever seen God, but Jesus has revealed him to us. And so we live in a world in exile where we can't see our God, and where the people around us think we're foolish and for believing in what we can't see. But this is not unusual in our day. That's why idols thrived. Physical idols of wood and stone were so prominent in the ancient world, and still are in our world today with idolatry that exists in various religions today. But people wanted something physical that they could see, because it seemed foolish to worship a God who was just invisible. Invisible means doesn't exist, right? That's what the world says. Number three, but we saw that we could rest emotionally, continue in faith, because God not only exists, that's your blank, but he is also in control, not the people you see. Okay, so the people you see are not in control, and we went through example after example in this book how the people who are in control have things reversed on them. So Xerxes, who's in control of all these kingdoms, 127 kingdoms of the earth, he can't control his own wife. He can't control his own household. Neither can the most noble of all, or the highest of all nobles in the land. Okay, and so all the power brokers, the people with control and power throughout the book of Esther have things reversed on them because God is really in control, and that's what he shows us in this book. So what do we do with this? These things, that we live in exile, that it appears people are in control, it appears God is absent. What do we do with this? Number 4, and here's where we get to this week. In your life and your death. In your life and in your death. For your life and for your death. And here's your blank. Trust this. Okay, now God is invisible. I can't show you anything. This is where faith comes in. Trust that this is true. Live your life according to this being true, believing that this is true. God will take care of you. God will take care of you. Even when everything else and everything you've already experienced all through your life, it's always happened this way. She's always been this way. He's always been this way. It's always happened this way at work. Whatever your situation is, trust that God will take care of you. Trust that God will take care of you. So you have a lot of verses there, and we'll hit those in a little bit. But this is a huge, huge point of the book. Trust that God will take care of you. A there in your outline, because God is not only in God is not only in control, but He is in control for you. He's in control for you. Last week we looked at how God's in control, and He's just frustrating the plans of those who think they're in control. He's frustrating the plans of those who seem to have the power and have political and earthly power here on the earth. Now we look at the fact that God is in control for you, particularly for His people and for you as one of His people, as one of His children. So let's take a look through these verses at how God is not only in control and not human beings, but how He's also in control for you. So you can look at, we're going to follow these verses down here, and I encourage you, open your Bibles and look at these verses as I mention them and summarize them for you. So first of all, how is God in control for you? Chapter 4, verse 14. Mordecai understands this. Chapter 4, verse 14. I'll give you a chance to get there. So chapter 4, verse 14, Mordecai says to Esther through a messenger, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." Mordecai realized he wasn't even though Esther was the queen, he realized God didn't even need that to work on behalf of His people. He realized God was in control and God would work it out some way. And if Esther didn't come through, God would work it out another way. We talked about God's providence this morning, and we confess that as our faith that we have. This is of great comfort to us. God is in control, working for His people, and He doesn't need to have a Christian as president or vice president or queen to work out things for His people. Chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Esther's taken in, and this is a point of great danger. She's about to become a concubine, okay? A lifelong of adultery to the king by force. Okay, that's Esther's situation. This is not a kid's story here. And so that's her, you know, and when women saw the king and the king wasn't pleased, they just became part of his harem. Okay? But we see God's goodness to Esther in the midst of her very precarious situation, being forcibly taken in by decree of the king into the king's presence. And she comes in and she arrives in this this complex of the king. And chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, she's taken in and immediately favored by the one in charge of all the women. Verse 12. Some of you will like this. Is God taking care of her or what? She gets beauty treatments for 12 months. Right? So verse 12, that's a neat place there. 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfume and cosmetics. Verse 15. Favored by everyone. God grants her favor in the eyes of everyone. Verses 17 and 18. She's favored above all and made queen of the land. Right? Mel Brooks, it's good to be the queen. So she becomes queen there. And there's a banquet that's named after her. They just call it Esther's banquet. And so God takes care of Esther, doesn't he? He puts her at the front of all the women in the best room. He gives her all these servants, gives her a year long of beauty treatments. And when she finally goes in to see the king, he says, essentially, I need to see no more. Right? Esther will be my queen. And she becomes his queen, and a banquet is thrown that's comparable to that banquet in the first of chapter 1 there. It's called Esther's banquet. Okay, so God's taking care of her despite what it looked like. Can you imagine the misery you'd be in if you were Mordecai or Esther, and Esther was taken away to be part of this pagan king's harem, to be a concubine for her? But God takes care of her. Then chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. So Mordecai says to Esther, you need to go in whether the king calls you or not. And so Esther looks like she's clever here. She does a good job. She goes in the outer court, and she lets the king see her. So she doesn't, right away head into destruction. She lets the king see her in case he might call her in, and he does. This is after the people of God have fasted for these 3 days, and she and her attendants have fasted for 3 days. And you see how God takes care of her. Instead of being killed that day, she's invited in to the king's presence in verses 1 and 2. Verse 3 and then verse 6 and chapter 7, verse 2, God is taking care of her. What's he say to her? What's your request? Up to half my kingdom, I'll give it to you. God is taking care of Esther, his child. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Xerxes determines to honor Mordecai. So Mordecai had a gallows built for him by Haman so that he would hang. And he was going to hang this next morning. But in this morning he's going to hang, unbeknownst to him, unbeknownst to Mordecai, God wakes up Xerxes the king. Xerxes is troubled in his sleep, and he wakes up and he has the annals of his history read to him, and he reads of Mordecai's tipping him off to this assassination plot. He realizes his life was saved by Mordecai. He asks what has been done for Mordecai, and they say nothing. And he says, hey, who's out there? Who just came in the door? And those who are in with him say, Haman just came in the door. And then the king says, call in Haman. And he says, what? And then he tells Haman, not only can he not put Mordecai on the gallows, which the king doesn't know about right now, but he tells Haman that Haman must lead Mordecai around the city in the king's royal robe with a king's crown on his head on a king's horse. The horse is ridden with the king's official insignia on the forehead of the horse. And Haman must proclaim, this is what is done for he whom the king delights to honor. And so Mordecai goes back to his job, and Haman goes back and cries. His head is covered with grief. He goes back home. God not only took care of Esther, but now we see God took care of Mordecai. The very morning Mordecai was to die, instead, Mordecai is led around the city as the most honored person, and the person who has to proclaim how high his honor is the chief of all nobles, Haman. So instead of Haman killing Mordecai, Haman is proclaiming Mordecai's praise and giving him honor. God takes care. God is in control, and he takes care of his people. Chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. This request of Esther's is finally heard. She gives 2 banquets for the king, and finally she gets her request. And Haman, the threat not only to Mordecai, but the one who has ordered this annihilation of the Jews later in the year, he is hanged. Threat extinguished, it looks like. He's hanged. Chapter 8, verse 1. See how God takes care of his people. Haman, who had all this money enough to pay all the soldiers and everyone who would go around and annihilate the Jew out of his own personal treasury, his estate is given to Esther. So now Esther is this person of all this great wealth. So Esther is taken care of again. And then chapter 2 and 10:3, Mordecai is given the king's signet ring. It's taken from Haman's finger. The signet ring was what the king would use to put his mark in the wax on any law he had written on the paper. The law had been written. They'd melt wax and then put the king's signet ring, his imprint in it, to prove that the law had come from the king. And that signet ring is taken from Haman's finger and put on Mordecai's finger. And so Mordecai goes from being gatekeeper in sackcloth to being second in command, chapter 10, verse 3. To being the one who can write laws and put the king's stamp on those laws. From going from sackcloth to wearing this blue and white and clothing of fine purple linen with a king's crown on his head. So Mordecai is taken care of. God is in control, and he's in control for you, his people. Now B. Just a note, so often doesn't mean that right away we'll know how God is taking care of us. B refers to this. Often the care is just a case of timing. It's just a case of timing, and often a case of in what way. God's care for us is a case of timing and in what way. Esther didn't know right away things would turn out all right. She had this year she went through of beauty treatments. For a whole year. Is God going to control things and care for me? Or am I going to be a concubine for the rest of my life? Not happily married, having kids, but a concubine. But then she's made queen. The timing, it took a year. And in what way was God going to save her? Well, pretty good way, huh? Made royalty. Better than what she had hoped. Chapter 2, Mordecai uncovers the assassination plot. But there's a timing issue here, isn't there? Even though Esther went to the king and said, these 2 servants of yours are planning to assassinate you, and I got this information from Mordecai the gatekeeper, nothing's done for Mordecai. And so Haman doesn't know. So Haman plots his death. But it's only later. And the timing of it is in the middle of the night. Later, when the king is awoken and reads the annals of his history. So it's not till chapter 6 that he's honored, but in chapter 2, his death was plotted. So it's timing, and how God saves us, how God rescues us, will be different often from what you were looking to, what you're expecting, or what you were praying. Sometimes you'll pray for God's deliverance in a certain way. God, would you just do this? And that's fine. You can pray for it in a certain way. And God will give you deliverance in another way. And he'll give you deliverance at a different time. Maybe sooner than you expected. Maybe later than you expected. Maybe your deliverance will be you die and you get to see Jesus. That's the best deliverance of all. Not for the people who love us, who are around us in our lives, But for us, each of us individually, that's the best deliverance of all. Free from all the chaos, free from these situations where we have to fast for 3 days in fear for our lives or fear for our future. What is this going to mean for me in the rest of my life, as Esther did? So it's a case of timing and in what way. So again, here's this trust issue. No matter what it looks like for you now, trust. Even though God's deliverance isn't happening for you right now, trust. It's a case of timing. But it will happen, just like Mordecai says. Maybe not from Esther, like he was hoping it would, but he knew, even if it didn't come from Esther, God would work it out in a different way. Now see, important for us to see. Important for us to see. Get it? See. This was the case in Jesus' life too. We're not told to do this, believe in God's deliverance and trust in his timing and that kind of thing. Jesus had to walk through this too as he endured this life in his human flesh as well. This was the case in Jesus' life. And Bob read for us from Philippians 2, 5 through 11. And it talks about this, that Jesus lived this life, and it was a life of humiliation and a life of suffering, in which he was a servant, and not only just a lowly servant, but also that he was put upon a cross, a humiliating death. And so those at the cross around him said, why isn't God saving him? See, they didn't quite trust in that timing, and they didn't trust in the way Jesus would be saved. They thought the way Jesus would be saved is that he would be delivered from the Romans. He'd come down off the cross, or as Pilate said, so are you a king? And Jesus says, no. And if I were a king, my people would have, or if my kingdom were of this world, my disciples would have fought for me. There'd be a physical war going on. But deliverance for Jesus would not be in that way. It would not be an earthly deliverance. It would not be a right now before his death deliverance. It would be a 3 days after his death deliverance. But Jesus, though he was low as a servant, though he was killed, though he was put to humiliating death, the verses 10 and 11 speak of what happens to Jesus in the end. When God's timing comes through, when God's way comes through for Jesus, as he trusts the Father on the cross, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, his name is above every name by order of God the Father. And to him, every knee must bow, even those knees who were mocking him there at the cross, even those knees who were lying about him in his trial before the Sanhedrin. And Jesus is ascended unto heaven, and he's seated at the right hand of the Father, and that means he's second in command, just like Haman. Pilate had the signet ring, didn't he? The Pharisees had the signet ring, didn't they? And they plotted not Mordecai's death, but the death of Jesus. But God had another plan. And he placed his signet ring on the finger of Jesus, so to speak. He put Jesus at his right hand. Look at chapter 10, verse 3. Look there. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes. Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, second in rank to the Father. Preeminent among God's people. Jesus is king and head of the church. He's preeminent among us and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews. We, his children, hold the one unique, only begotten Son of God as preeminent. He is highest among those who've ever trod this earth on 2 feet. Because, look what Mordecai does, and it's what Jesus does. He worked for the good of his people. That's what Jesus did for you and me. He worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all of us. Get it? 1 John. Jesus is our advocate before the Father. He speaks well of us before the King. When we go to stand before the judgment seat, when Jesus comes back and we know all our sin, Jesus stands up before us as our advocate, as our defense attorney. And he says, "But Father, this is one of mine. This is one of my favored ones." And the Father says, "You've got the signet ring. I trust you." And this is not by the Father's incompetence or lack of care. This is at the Father's order. He sent Jesus so that our sins could be placed upon him. And Jesus heard that for our welfare, for the good of us, his people, he would have to come to the earth and take the form of a man, the form of a servant, and die a miserable, humiliating death. And he did it. And he was out there in the middle of the city, right? In sackcloth and ashes, so to speak, wailing, in distress. He did that. He did that for us. Now, number 5, lastly. Since there is joy before you, right, Anthony? Ha ha ha. Since there is joy before you or in your future, after the hardships, continue in your faith. So we've talked about this idea as the guiding principle, the guiding exhortation throughout this whole book. Rest emotionally and continue in faith. One of the reasons we continue in faith is that we see there is joy before us, and that's shown in this book as well. Look at Esther chapter 8, verse 15. Chapter 8, verse 15. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a, keyword, joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province, in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebration. And many people of the other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. 2 Corinthians 4:16 says this, right up this alley. Paul says, "Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." What is unseen, the eternal, is the stuff of joy. It's the stuff of our future. But what we see, our here and now, is affliction. And Paul says we don't lose heart because in view of how great our joy is at our God's deliverance of us, our affliction, no matter how bad it is here, and it can be very bad, in comparison, it's light and momentary. And Paul could speak so. Whipped to the extent of Roman law, as many times as Roman law would allow, stoned outside a city gate and left for dead, shipwrecked, jailed. Paul knew affliction. He knew troubles, and he called them light and momentary in view of what he could see in front of him. So Jesus endured his hardships by keeping in mind the joy awaiting him when his hardships were done. And that's what Bob read for us in Hebrews 12:2. For the joy, though Jesus despised the shame of the cross. He wasn't saying this affliction is great and this nice. No, he despised it. He despised the mocking. He despised the shame. Yet for the joy set before him, for the joy set before him, for the joy that was in his future, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. And that's what we're called to do. For the joy before us, whenever God's deliverance comes for us, sometimes it comes in this life, and he reverses circumstances for us, the circumstances we thought would happen to us. And sometimes it's not until we see him face to face. Either way, it's joy, and we have assurance, and we believe and we trust that God will deliver us with whatever timing and with whatever way, or in whatever way is good and right and to our best and for his glory. So number one there, Jesus knew his life on earth would be hardship. That's Romans 12:2. Jesus, going to his hardship, the cross, despised the mocking, the disgrace, the shame of it. It reads, Jesus endured the cross, in scorning its shame. Number two, but Jesus also knew the joy that would be after it. And so the writer of Hebrews gives that to us. Know the joy that's in your future so that you can endure the now. So Jesus would have this twofold joy, one of being reunited with the Father, and secondly, the joy of saving us. And that he would have us forgiven with him for eternity. The joy set before him. He endured the cross, which he had to do to have us be with him. And then number three, with this thought in mind of the joy set before him, he endured the cross. So we're called to be like him. We're called to be like him. Be like Jesus. Yep, life stinks, but endure the hardship because deliverance is coming in some way, some shape, some form, and at some time. Be like him. Or as Hebrews 12:2 puts it, fix your eyes on Jesus. That's your number one point there. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. As I was considering this verse in light of the message of Esther, I thought, maybe that's what this verse means. What does it mean that Jesus is the author or perfecter of our faith? He's showing us how to do it. That's certainly the way that Hebrews 12:2 is using this example of Jesus. Jesus is showing us how to get through life. Know the joy set before you, and endure the shame and endure the hardship of this life, keeping in mind the joy set before you. This will be done. Like when I'm jogging when I'm running one of my long runs, I say, 2 more miles, or 1 more mile, or last half mile. The joy before me, the joy is being done. People talk about runner's high. I'm not sure about that. I don't know about that. The joy is being done. The joy is having done it. It's like I talk to the guys in the locker room at the Riverwood Athletic Club. I say, you done? And they say, yes. And I say, that's the good news, isn't it? They say, yes. The joy is that I'm done. So fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. How does he get through it? He gets through it by keeping the joy in his head. So number 2, he is your model. He is your model. Continuing in faith by keeping in mind the joy that are in store for you after the trials of this life. Okay, he's your model. Continuing in faith by keeping in mind the joy after the trials of life. Must have been tempting for Jesus to abandon ship as he went through his arrest and his trial and his threefold trial, and then being taken to the cross and allowing himself to be taken up to the cross. At any point, he had the power to defeat physically those who are around him, but he doesn't do that. But he keeps in mind the joy in front of him. And so he continues in faith and follows the Father's will for him to die for his people. So, Why will it be okay for us? We talked 2 weeks ago about how people, when they're in hardship, someone comes around them and says, hey, it'll be okay. These things all have a way of working out. And we say, there's no guarantee of that. If there is no God who loves you, no guarantee. If life is random, if there's not God in heaven watching over you, which we know as believers He is, then there's no assurance of that. But we know it will work out. We're like Mordecai. We don't know how, maybe through Esther, maybe through somebody else, but Jesus has worked it out for us already. Now it's all just a matter of timing. It's all just a matter of timing. So conclusion, to summarize what we've talked about. Rest in faith. Rest in the faith that God cares for you. Rest in the faith that God cares for you. And He is also in control of all things. Have that faith. God is in control here, not the people. And He will always take care of me. He will always take care of me. In death, and that's what we already believed as we came here as believers. We all came here this morning. We knew that. God will take care of us in death. That's kind of the easy part for us as believers because we talk about that so much. But the other thing is trust that God will always take care of you, even in life. Even in life. Let's pray.